My name is Adelaide Vance. I am 25 years old. And on the night I secured a contract with the most elite corporate law firm in Delaware, my parents asked me if I could just eat dinner at home so they could go watch my 28-year-old brother play a Tuesday night gig at a dive bar. I sat in a parking garage holding a piece of paper that guaranteed a starting salary higher than their combined income, and my mother told me not to make a fuss. She told me Connor needed the support. I will tell you exactly how that phone call ended. But first, I need you to hold her exact excuse in your mind, because 2 years later, that same mother would sit across from me in a glass-walled deposition room, facing felony fraud charges, begging me to save the house she was about to lose. Welcome back to Orange Vengeance, where family secrets come to light, and the quiet daughters finally stop paying the ransom. If you have ever been the responsible one who was told to shrink yourself to keep the peace, you are in the right place. Drop a comment below, tell me your age and where you are watching from, and be sure to subscribe. This story starts with an empty table at a steakhouse, and it ends with a legally binding document that shattered my family's perfect facade forever. Let me take you back to that parking garage. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my sedan, in the underground lot of the Delaware Trust Building. On the passenger seat rested a cream-colored envelope. It was heavy cardstock, the kind that costs more per sheet than my weekly grocery run. Inside was an associate contract from Vanguard and Croft. In Wilmington, Delaware, the undisputed capital of American corporate law, that envelope meant you had survived the gauntlet. Delaware is a place where more corporations are registered than people. It is a tight, wealthy legal ecosystem where partners know every judge in the Court of Chancery by their first name. Getting a seat at that table at 25 was rare. I picked up my phone and called my mother. The exhaust fan in the parking garage hummed a low, steady note. "Mom," I said when the line clicked open. "I got it. Vanguard offered me the associate spot. I just signed the contract." There was a pause. I heard the clatter of silverware in the background, a cabinet door shutting. My mother Linda sighed the way she always sighed when my life interrupted her schedule. "Oh, Addie, that's nice," she said. Her tone carried the polite, distracted cadence of someone reading a grocery receipt. "Listen, your brother just called. His band managed to get a Tuesday night slot at that venue in Newark. He's a nervous wreck about the turnout. Your father and I already bought tickets online to fill out the crowd. Can you just eat at home tonight? We'll celebrate your paper thing this weekend." Your paper thing. I sat looking at the steering wheel. In the Vance family ledger, Connor and his garage band were an investment requiring constant capital, while my legal career was an administrative footnote. Connor was 28. He still brought his laundry home on Sundays. He had dropped out of 2 different master's programs, and each time my parents had cushioned his fall with their savings. When Connor needed a new amplifier, they skipped my college graduation dinner. When Connor felt overwhelmed by his part-time retail job, my father drove 3 states over to pack up his apartment and move him back into his childhood bedroom. Meanwhile, I had funded my own law degree with scholarships and 3 years of night shifts. My parents had built an entire architecture of excuses for my brother, and they used my resilience as the foundational cement. "I understand," I said. I kept my voice perfectly level. "In corporate law, you don't show the opposing side your hand. In my family, you didn't show them your disappointment." "You're always so low maintenance, Addie," my mother replied. She meant it as a compliment. "In our house, my self-sufficiency was the currency I paid to keep the peace. We'll call you tomorrow. Have a good night." The line went dead. I didn't strike the dashboard. I didn't cry. Crying is a request for help, and I learned a long time ago that my family's jurisdiction ended where my needs began. I shifted the car into drive and paid my parking ticket at the booth. I drove through downtown Wilmington as the streetlights flickered on. The glass towers of the financial district glowed against the dark sky. It was a town built on contracts, leverage, and fine print. I was learning how to pierce corporate veils, yet I had never dared to pierce the one covering my own family. I was 25 and held the keys to the most prestigious kingdom in the city, but my mother still thought it was just a paper thing. 10 minutes later, I handed my keys to the valet outside the St. Regis Steakhouse. The restaurant sat in the heart of the corporate district, a quiet temple of mahogany, brass, and expense accounts. Partners came here to close acquisitions. Rivals came here to settle out of court. The air smelled like expensive bourbon and seared bone-in ribeye. It was the kind of place you went when you had truly arrived. I walked through the revolving glass doors. The hostess, a woman holding a leather-bound reservation book, offered a professional smile. "Good evening," she said. "How many in your party?" One, I said. Her pen paused for a fraction of a second. "Just you, just me." She led me past circular booths filled with men in tailored suits and women reviewing prospectuses. They were all celebrating something. They all had an audience. She seated me at a small square table near the back corner. I sat down and smoothed my blazer. I took the cream-colored Vanguard and Croft envelope and set it squarely in the center of the white linen tablecloth. The contrast was sharp. I had just secured a position in the most elite legal ecosystem in the country, and I was marking the occasion next to an empty chair. I poured myself a glass of ice water. In a few minutes, a waitress would walk up to this table. She would notice the envelope. She would ask a simple question, and the answer I gave her would set off a chain of events that would eventually force my parents into a corner they could never manipulate their way out of. But sitting there in the dim light of the steakhouse, I just looked at the empty seat across from me. It framed the exact shape of my family's absence. I didn't know it yet, but that empty chair was the best gift my mother ever gave me. It was the night I finally stopped waiting for them to show up. Brenda was a seasoned fixture at the St. Regis. A woman in her late 50s wearing a crisp black apron and the sensible shoes of someone who had spent 2 decades navigating the egos of the city's legal elite. She possessed the sharp situational awareness that separated career servers from seasonal hires. She knew which equity partners preferred corner booths and which defense attorneys needed their martinis bone dry before a difficult trial. She approached my table, set down a silver breadbasket, and took my drink order. As she reached for the menu, her eyes caught the heavy cardstock envelope resting beside my water glass. The Vanguard and Sterling logo was embossed in silver ink across the front. "Celebrating a milestone tonight?" Brenda asked. Her tone held professional curiosity rather than pity. I appreciated the distinction. "An offer," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Just me tonight." I did not elaborate because over-explaining is a sign of weakness in negotiation. I also did not want to vocalize the reality of my situation out loud. My parents had spent 20 years training me to minimize my own space. During my senior year of high school, when I won the state debate championship, my father asked me to store the trophy in my closet. He claimed that looking at it made Connor feel inadequate about his failing grades. I learned early on that my success was a structural hazard in our household. I was expected to achieve quietly, ensuring my stability never cast a shadow over my brother's perpetual struggles. Eating alone in a steakhouse after securing a job that most law students would sacrifice sleep to obtain felt terribly familiar. It was merely the latest iteration of my family's standard operating procedure. Brenda gave a single slow nod. She did not offer a patronizing tilt of her head or a sympathetic sigh. "I will bring you the reserve wine list," she said, before turning away and disappearing into the bustling corridors near the kitchen. I sat in the dim amber light and watched the room function. The restaurant was an ecosystem built on leverage and fiduciary duties. Across the dining room, a junior partner from a rival firm was sweating through a pitch to a prospective client. 2 tables down, a federal judge was enjoying a quiet dinner. I felt a brief wave of imposter syndrome try to creep into my chest, but I quickly compartmentalized it. I had earned my seat in this room through brutal attrition. I had worked full-time as a paralegal while attending evening classes, briefing cases on the commuter train, and surviving on black coffee and adrenaline. My family had never asked how I managed the tuition or the exhaustion. They simply assumed I would handle it. I always handled it. 12 minutes passed. I checked my watch, preparing to order a dry red wine and a bone-in strip steak. Instead, the ambient noise of the dining room underwent a sudden, unmistakable shift. The clinking of glasses quieted. The low murmur of negotiations paused. I looked up. Walking out of the private dining room at the rear of the restaurant was Victor Sterling. He was the managing partner of the firm I had just agreed to join. He was a man who moved with the gravitational pull of someone who could dissolve a major corporation before breakfast. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit, and his expression was a calculated mask of authority. Behind him walked 5 senior partners, a formidable phalanx of legal architects who defined the state's corporate landscape. They bypassed the exit and headed directly toward my corner table. I sat up straighter, my mind racing through potential breaches of protocol. Had I violated a confidentiality clause? Was I trespassing in a space reserved for senior staff? Victor reached my table and stopped. He looked down at the cream envelope, then looked directly at me. Adelaide Vance, Victor said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact entered into the record. Yes, Mr. Sterling, I replied, standing up to meet his eye level. He gestured for me to sit down. Brenda informed me that my newest associate is sitting in the main dining room celebrating her contract by herself. Is that accurate? I did not blink. I did not offer a sob story about my brother's indie band or my parents' misplaced priorities. I offered the plain truth. It is accurate, sir. I signed the paperwork an hour ago. Victor turned to the hostess who was hovering nervously near the wait station. Bring 5 more chairs. We are merging tables. The next 20 minutes felt like a surreal deposition where I was the favored expert witness. The senior partners pulled up chairs, squeezing into the small footprint of my table. Victor signaled Brenda, who materialized with a bottle of vintage champagne and crystal flutes. The partners did not patronize me. They asked sharp, penetrating questions about my thesis on corporate tax loopholes and my strategy during mock trial competitions. They tested my knowledge on recent Chancery Court rulings. I answered flawlessly, maintaining my composure. They treated me like a genuine asset, evaluating my intellect rather than my emotional state. Victor raised his glass. The amber light caught the bubbles rising in the crystal. To Adelaide, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a closing argument. You will learn very quickly that in this profession, loyalty is the only currency that matters. You chose Vanguard and Sterling today. Tonight we choose you. Welcome to the firm. We tapped our glasses together. The crystal chimed a clean, sharp sound. I took a sip, and a profound realization settled into my chest, solidifying like concrete poured over a reinforced steel grid. Loyalty is not a biological default. It is a binding contract earned through mutual investment. My parents had defaulted on their contract a long time ago, continuously asking for emotional extensions while investing all their available capital into my brother. These lawyers, these strangers who billed by the hour, had just demonstrated more genuine investment in my future in 20 minutes than my mother had in 2 decades. They did not ask me to shrink or hide my accomplishments. They pulled up chairs and asked me to expand. The dinner progressed into the late evening. I ordered the steak. I listened to Victor dissect a recent appellate court ruling while the head of litigation shared strategies on corporate takeovers. I belonged here. I was not an afterthought. I was a valued member of the board. Then my phone vibrated against the white linen tablecloth. The screen illuminated, projecting a harsh digital glow across the silver cutlery. It was a text message from my mother. Part of me anticipated a belated congratulation. Perhaps a quick apology for missing the evening, or a photograph from Connor's concert showing a packed venue. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. The message contained 2 sentences. It did not mention Vanguard and Sterling. It did not ask how my dinner tasted or if I felt proud of my achievement. It read, Connor's gig was great, but his landlord is threatening eviction again. Since you have that new corporate salary starting, we need you to co-sign his studio lease tomorrow so he doesn't lose his momentum. I stared at the illuminated text. The audacity was so predictable it felt clinical. Connor had never held a lease past 6 months without requiring a financial bailout. He viewed rent as a suggestion, an annoying administrative hurdle that stifled his artistic process. My parents had drained their emergency fund, keeping his various apartments out of foreclosure. Now that their well was running dry, they were turning to mine. My mother was not asking for a favor. She was assessing my new net worth and immediately attempting to attach a lien to it. She viewed my success only as a newly acquired line of credit to underwrite her golden child's inevitable failures. In the language of my trade, she was asking me to legally bind my pristine credit to a high-risk debtor with a historical pattern of default. It was a terrible deal. Victor noticed my gaze drop. "Everything all right, Adelaide?" I looked up at the managing partner. I looked at the colleagues who had chosen to sit with me, men and women who respected the precise weight of a signature. Then I looked back down at the screen. I did not type a response. I did not offer an excuse to my mother. I reached out and turned the phone face down on the table. The screen went dark against the linen. "Everything is perfect," I said, picking up my champagne flute. "Just closing an old account." 3 months evaporated into the grueling, highly structured rhythm of corporate law. At Vanguard and Sterling, my days were governed by billable hours, ironclad statutes, and the predictable mechanics of the Delaware corporate code. I thrived in that environment. Unlike my childhood, the law offered clear, unapologetic boundaries. In the Court of Chancery, if you breach a fiduciary duty, you pay a penalty. There are no emotional loopholes, no guilt trips, and no changing the rules to accommodate the loudest complaint in the room. I spent my weeks analyzing merger agreements, shielding holding companies from hostile litigation, and learning how to dismantle predatory contracts clause by clause. My life was finally my own, funded by my own labor and protected by my own competence. Then my mother summoned me. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon as a calendar request disguised as a casual text message. She asked me to come over for Sunday dinner. We had barely spoken since the night of my solitary celebration at the steakhouse. Her sudden desire for family time felt less like an olive branch and more like a subpoena. I accepted anyway. I treated the visit as a mandatory compliance meeting, a necessary obligation to maintain a baseline of peace. I drove out to the suburbs on Sunday evening, leaving the sharp glass skylines of Wilmington behind for the muted, familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood. The house smelled like roast chicken and old resentments. When I walked through the front door, the family dynamic snapped back into its original shape with chilling speed. My father David sat in his recliner watching a golf tournament with the volume muted. He offered me a tight smile that did not reach his eyes, the expression of a man committed to observing conflict rather than preventing it. My brother Connor occupied the center of the living room. At 28, he still dressed like a college sophomore, aiming for an effortless grunge aesthetic. He sat on the sofa loudly detailing his new artistic vision to anyone who would listen. We sat around the dining room table. The conversation felt hollow, a curated performance where my parents asked polite, superficial questions about my daily commute, expertly avoiding any real inquiry into my legal work. We ate in relative silence until the plates were cleared. That was when my mother initiated the ambush. She did not pour coffee. She reached into a canvas tote bag resting beside her chair and pulled out a thick stack of stapled paper. She slid it across the polished oak table. It stopped inches from my hands. "Connor has a brilliant opportunity," my mother said, her voice adopting the bright, artificial tone of a television anchor. "He is opening his own recording studio. He even formed an LLC all by himself online. We are so proud of him taking this next step." Connor leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a smug sense of accomplishment. "It is a warehouse space down by the river," he said. "Perfect acoustics. The landlord is giving me a steal on the square footage, but he needs the paperwork signed by tomorrow morning, or he gives the spot to someone else." My mother tapped the top page of the document. "Since you do this corporate stuff now, we want you to look it over. Give it your legal blessing. Just a quick review to make sure the fine print is standard, and then you can rubber stamp it for us." I looked at the document. It was a commercial lease agreement. I picked it up and began to read. My training took over, overriding the immediate annoyance of being used for free labor. Within 30 seconds, the red flags multiplied into a legal disaster. The landlord was not giving Connor a steal. He was setting a trap. The lease contained a draconian acceleration clause, meaning if Connor missed a single rent payment, the entire 5-year balance became due immediately. There was no cure period to rectify late payments. Worse, the document required a sweeping personal guarantee. Whoever signed it would waive all limited liability protections, exposing their personal bank accounts, future wages, and physical assets to summary judgment in the event of default. It was a financial death warrant. I set the papers back down on the oak table. I aligned the edges perfectly. "I cannot review this for you," I said, my tone remaining steady, "and I strongly advise against signing it." Connor scoffed, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling. "Come on, Addie. It is just a standard lease. Stop trying to make everything sound so dramatic." "It is not standard," I replied. "The default interest rate is predatory. The acceleration clause triggers upon a single late payment. If your studio fails to generate immediate consistent revenue, this contract allows the landlord to seize everything you own and everything mom and dad own if they back you. Furthermore, as an associate at Vanguard and Sterling, I am bound by strict conflict of interest protocols. I cannot provide informal, undocumented legal counsel, nor can I rubber stamp a high-risk commercial liability for a family member. It violates my firm's ethics policies." My mother's face hardened. The bright artificial anchor persona vanished, replaced by the rigid enforcer I knew too well. She placed both hands flat on the table. "You are not at your fancy office right now," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "We don't talk like lawyers in this house. We talk like family. Your brother needs this space to launch his career. We asked for 5 minutes of your time to help him, and you are quoting ethics policies at us." "The bank does not care if we talk like family," I said, meeting her stare without flinching. "The court does not care either. This contract is a financial hazard. I am giving you the best advice possible by telling you to walk away from it. I will not put my name or my firm's name anywhere near this transaction." "Nobody asked you to put your firm's name on it," Connor snapped, slamming a hand against the back of his chair. "We just asked you to be supportive for once in your life. But you always have to act like you are better than us just because you wear a suit now." My father remained silent, staring intently at his empty coffee cup. He was the classic biter, delegating the dirty work of emotional manipulation to his wife and son while retaining plausible deniability. I looked at the three of them. I saw the rusted mechanics of my childhood operating in real time. They did not want my expertise. They wanted my liability. They wanted me to absorb the risk so they could continue funding Connor's delusions without facing the consequences. I stood up. I picked up my purse and pushed my chair back from the table. "I am leaving," I said. "Do not sign that lease. If you do, you are doing it against my explicit legal advice." "Sit down," Adelaide, my mother commanded, pointing a rigid finger at my empty chair. "We are not finished discussing this." "I am finished," I said. I turned and walked toward the front door. The house felt suffocating heavy with the scent of roasted chicken and unearned entitlement. I did not run. I walked at a measured, deliberate pace, honoring the boundary I had just drawn in the sand. I opened the front door, stepped out into the cool evening air, and locked it behind me. I got into my car and started the engine. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles pale under the streetlights. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but beneath it, a profound sense of clarity. For the first time, I had refused to pay their emotional tax. I had looked at the family ledger and declined the charge. I shifted the car into drive and began the commute back to the quiet, logical sanctuary of my life in Wilmington. 10 minutes down the highway, my phone chimed from the center console. I waited until I reached a red light before glancing at the screen. It was a text message from my father. He had sat in cowardly silence through the entire dinner, offering neither support nor condemnation. Now, safely hidden behind a screen, he delivered the final word. The message glowed against the dark interior of my car. It read, "We will handle Connor's paperwork ourselves. You just focus on your career." It sounded like a dismissal. I did not know yet that it was a threat. 8 months passed in a blur of billable hours and high-stakes negotiations. The rhythm of mergers and acquisitions at Vanguard and Sterling became my sanctuary. My office on the 32nd floor offered a panoramic view of the Christina River, a daily reminder of the distance I had placed between myself and my childhood home. I drafted indemnification clauses, restructured debt profiles for Fortune 500 clients, and learned to spot a bad deal before the ink dried. The partners trusted my meticulous nature. They did not know that my obsessive attention to detail was forged in a house where unpredictability ruled. During my undergraduate years, I worked 2 jobs to cover tuition because my parents diverted my college fund to cover a failed app startup Connor tried to launch. I learned early that nobody else would audit the ledger of my life, so I audited it myself. My family remained a distant, silent echo. My father kept his promise. They handled Connor's paperwork. The fracture occurred on a mundane Tuesday afternoon in late October. The sky outside my window was gray and threatening rain. My desk was covered in red-lined drafts for an upcoming acquisition. I took a sip of lukewarm coffee and glanced at my secondary monitor. An automated email pinged in my personal inbox. It was a standard notification from a Delaware registered agent service, a complimentary monitoring alert I set up years ago after a data breach at a retail store. The subject line indicated a status update on a corporate charter filing matching my social security number. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A cold, distinct prickle of adrenaline traveled down my spine. I had not registered a new corporate entity. I clicked the secure link. The notification directed me to a newly formed limited liability company. The entity name was Sonic Soundscapes LLC. It was Connor's recording studio. I did not call my mother. I did not text my brother. I opened my firm's direct access portal to the Delaware Division of Corporations database. In this state, corporate veils are thick, but a junior associate with premier software access can peer through the fabric in seconds. I entered the entity number and pulled the full operating agreement, the articles of organization, and the commercial loan attachments. The loading wheel spun for 2 seconds. The screen populated with a 50-page PDF. I scrolled past the standard boilerplate language, my eyes skimming the paragraphs describing the rental terms, the security deposits, and the insurance requirements. I reached the financial disclosures. There was a commercial business loan originated through a secondary tier lender known for exorbitant interest rates. The principal amount sat heavy on the page, $150,000. I kept scrolling, moving deliberately toward the signature blocks. The digital pages flickered past. The final page listed the primary debtor as Sonic Soundscapes LLC, with Connor Vance signing as the managing member. Below his name sat the guarantor section. The guarantor was the individual assuming full personal liability if the LLC defaulted. There was my name, Adelaide Vance. Below the typed print rested my signature. I leaned closer to the monitor. It was a flawless digital replica, but the pacing of the letters struck a specific distant memory. The loop on the capital A was slightly wider than my current handwriting. The cross on the T slanted at an angle I abandoned during law school. I recognized it. It was the exact signature from a housing lease I signed during my sophomore year of college. My parents had demanded I figure out my own off-campus accommodations because they were busy bailing Connor out of a minor property damage dispute. I had emailed them a scanned copy of my lease for their records. They had kept that file, cropped the signature, and digitally pasted it onto a 6-figure commercial loan. I sat in my ergonomic chair. The ambient hum of the HVAC system filled the quiet office. I experienced no tears, no gasping breaths, no sudden urge to scream. Crying implies a loss of control, a hope that someone will hear you and offer comfort. I knew better. Instead, a chilling, pristine legal logic descended over my thoughts like frost on a windowpane. My parents had not merely crossed a familial boundary. They had crossed the threshold of the penal code. The document staring back at me represented felony wire fraud, identity theft, and uttering a forged instrument. The penalty for these offenses involved mandatory minimum sentences, not a stern lecture at Sunday dinner. I analyzed their psychology with the detached precision of a prosecuting attorney mapping a timeline. Why would they do this? The answer was agonizingly simple. They believed my compliance was a permanent condition. They assumed that when the loan inevitably defaulted, the responsible daughter would simply absorb the financial blow. They calculated that I would quietly pay off the debt to protect my pristine credit score and shield the family name from public disgrace. They thought they could weaponize my success to subsidize my brother's failure, confident that my fear of a scandal would keep me silent. They assumed I would play my assigned role. They failed to account for the fact that I no longer worked for them. I moved my mouse and clicked print. The heavy commercial printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, churning out the physical evidence of their crime page by page. I retrieved the stack of warm paper and placed it into a fresh manila folder. I was treating my family the exact same way I treated a hostile corporate takeover. I was building a fortress. I spent the next 2 hours fortifying my position. I did not log out of my workstation. I opened secure browser tabs and navigated to Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. I enacted hard security freezes on my social security number across all 3 bureaus, locking down any future attempts to leverage my identity. I requested detailed credit reports to ensure they had not opened any other phantom accounts. The loan for the studio was the only anomaly. Next, I needed to secure my alibi. The forged document bore a digital timestamp and a notary stamp from a storefront shipping center in my parents' suburban town. The date of execution was a Tuesday in late September, exactly 4 months prior. I accessed my firm's human resources portal and pulled my timekeeping records for that specific week. On that Tuesday, I had billed 12 hours working in a secure conference room on the 32nd floor. My keycard access logs confirmed I entered the building at 7 in the morning and did not swipe out until 9 at night. The parking garage cameras and the firm's internal network logins provided an airtight, indisputable geographic perimeter. I was 40 miles away from the notary counter when my signature supposedly materialized on that page. I printed the keycard logs. I printed the billable hour summaries. I placed them in the manila folder alongside the fraudulent lease. My phone sat on the edge of the desk. I looked at the dark screen. The urge to call my father and demand an explanation flashed through my mind, but I extinguished it immediately. Confrontation without leverage is just noise. If I tipped my hand now, they would attempt to cover their tracks, perhaps pressure Connor into refinancing, or deploy my mother to manipulate my emotions until I agreed to legitimize the forgery. I would not give them the opportunity to control the narrative. In corporate litigation, the most effective strategy is often patience. You wait for the opposing party to make a fatal error. You wait for the leverage to mature. Connor lacked the discipline to run a profitable business. A recording studio required steady clients, rigorous marketing, and financial acumen. My brother possessed none of these traits. It was only a matter of time before the venture hemorrhaged cash and the landlord initiated collection proceedings. The crisis was inevitable. I locked the manila folder inside the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I turned the small metal key, slipped it onto my keyring, and returned to my red-lined drafts. I would let them enjoy their stolen foundation for a few more months. I would let Connor pretend to be a successful entrepreneur. I would let my parents bask in the delusion that they had orchestrated a flawless rescue. They believed they had built a secure future for their golden child on my back. They did not realize they had just handed me the legal authority to dismantle their entire lives. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the trap to spring. 7 months drifted past the glass windows of my corner office. The changing seasons mirrored the predictable decay of Connor's recording studio. I knew the business model was failing because my mother stopped posting about it on her social media profiles. In my family, silence was always the loudest indicator of a deficit. During my childhood, whenever Connor brought home a failing report card or backed his car into a neighbor's retaining wall, our household entered a state of quiet, frantic mitigation. My father would write a check to the neighbor before the broken taillight glass even settled in the grass. My mother would draft a lengthy email to the school principal blaming the curriculum for Connor's lack of focus. They possessed a remarkable talent for insulating my brother from the consequences of his own actions. I knew they were currently applying that same frantic mitigation to his commercial lease, but a corporate landlord is not a sympathetic neighbor. A corporate landlord operates on a rigid schedule of accounts receivable. The collision finally occurred on a humid Thursday morning in late May. I was reviewing a complex merger addendum when my desk phone rang. The caller ID did not display my paralegal or a junior partner seeking advice. It displayed the private extension of Victor Sterling. I picked up the receiver. Adelaide, Victor said. His voice was smooth, carrying the distinct cadence of a man who rarely had to repeat himself. "I need you in my office, now." The line disconnected before I could offer an affirmative reply. I placed the receiver back onto its cradle. A cold, heavy sensation settled at the base of my throat. Managing partners do not summon first-year associates to the top floor for casual status updates. In a firm of our size, receiving a direct summons from Victor Sterling meant you had either just secured a landmark victory for a priority client, or you had triggered a catastrophic liability. Since I had not closed any landmark deals that morning, the process of elimination left only one option. The trap had sprung. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and walked toward the elevator bank. My heels clicked against the polished marble floors, ticking like a metronome counting down to my professional ruin. I pressed the call button and waited. My mind raced through the ethical guidelines of the Delaware bar. A conflict of interest involving a direct financial liability is a career death sentence for a corporate attorney. If you are named as a defendant in a lawsuit involving one of your own firm's clients, you become an immediate ethical hazard. The standard protocol is swift termination to protect the firm's reputation and maintain client privilege. My parents had not just forged my signature on a loan, they had inadvertently aimed a loaded weapon directly at my legal license. The elevator doors parted. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the executive floor. I did not experience panic. Panic is a useless emotion reserved for people who do not understand the rules of the game. I experienced a pristine, calculated focus. I had prepared for this moment for 7 months. I approached Victor's suite. His executive assistant offered a tight, sympathetic nod and gestured toward the heavy oak doors. I turned the brass handle and stepped inside. Victor sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk. The room smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and quiet authority. He did not look angry. He looked entirely analytical, observing me with the detached precision of a surgeon diagnosing a complex fracture. Resting squarely in the center of his desk was a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue cover. The blue backing indicated a formal complaint filed in the Delaware Court of Chancery. "Close the door, Adelaide, and take a seat," Victor instructed. I pulled out one of the leather guest chairs and sat down, keeping my posture rigid and my hands folded in my lap. "We have a unique procedural anomaly sitting on my desk this morning." Victor began lacing his fingers together over the blue folder. "As you know, Vanguard Sterling represents Apex Real Estate Holdings. They are a cornerstone client for our litigation department. Yesterday afternoon, Apex filed a standard debt recovery lawsuit against a commercial tenant who defaulted on a 5-year lease." Victor reached out and rotated the blue folder, sliding it slowly across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped directly in front of me. "Apex is seeking accelerated rent, default interest, and punitive damages, totaling just over $200,000, he continued. "The primary debtor is an entity called Sonic Soundscapes. The defendants listed are the managing member Connor Vance and the personal guarantor backing the debt." I looked down at the caption printed on the first page of the complaint. My name was bolded in stark black ink. Victor leaned back in his leather chair. The silence in the room stretched thick and testing. When a law firm discovers that one of its own attorneys is being sued by one of its premier clients, the usual result is an immediate exit interview. I waited for him to demand my resignation badge. I waited for the inevitable speech about ethical firewalls and maintaining the integrity of the partnership. Instead, Victor asked one calculated question. "Did you sign this document, Adelaide?" I met his gaze. I did not blink. I did not offer a convoluted narrative about my family's dysfunction or my brother's chronic failures. In this room, only the facts possessed value. "No, Mr. Sterling," I replied. "I did not sign that commercial lease. I have never entered into a financial agreement with that entity, nor have I ever authorized anyone to act as my proxy in a commercial transaction." Victor studied my face for a long moment. He was a man who spent his entire career evaluating the credibility of witnesses and corporate officers. He was searching for a micro-expression of guilt, a subtle shift of the eyes that would indicate a lie. He found nothing. The signature on the guarantor page is a perfect match to the one we have on file in your human resources packet. Victor noted, his tone devoid of accusation, merely stating a variable in the equation. It is a digital replica, I explained, keeping my voice steady. It was cropped from a residential housing lease I executed during my sophomore year of college and superimposed onto the guarantor line. Furthermore, the notary stamp on that document is dated a Tuesday in late September of last year. If you pull my building access logs and my billable hour metrics for that specific date, you will see that I was physically present in a conference room on the 32nd floor of this building from 7 in the morning until 9 at night. I have already compiled the necessary data. The timestamp on the notary seal places the execution of that document 40 miles away from my verifiable location. It is a forged instrument. Victor remained silent for another 10 seconds. He processed the variables, weighing the geographical alibi against the physical evidence. Slowly, a faint, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany desk. In my 30 years practicing law, I have seen families destroy each other over trust funds, inheritance disputes, and hostile board takeovers, Victor said quietly. But pasting a daughter's signature onto a doomed commercial lease to subsidize a failing business venture is a remarkably arrogant strategy. They assumed you would quietly pay the settlement to avoid a scandal at your new job. Yes, sir, I agreed. That was their exact calculation. Victor picked up a silver fountain pen and tapped it thoughtfully against the legal pad resting beside his keyboard. If you had signed this, Adelaide, I would have security escort you out of the building before the hour was finished, he stated, his voice dropping into a register of absolute certainty. We do not employ liabilities. However, we also do not tolerate third-party actors committing felony fraud against our associates. Vanguard Sterling protects its own investments. If someone attempts to weaponize the legal system against an attorney working under my roof, I take it as a personal insult to my firm. I exhaled a slow, measured breath. The crushing weight of the anticipated termination vanished, replaced by a surge of profound validation. My parents had spent my entire life teaching me that I was a secondary asset, useful only when I could absorb my brother's collateral damage. They assumed I would face this crisis alone, terrified of losing my career. They had no idea I had spent the last year building an alliance with the most ruthless litigators in the state. We are going to file a motion to sever you from this lawsuit immediately. Victor continued, his tone shifting into battle strategy. We will present your alibi directly to the Chancery judge, attach the digital forensics, proving the signature was lifted, and formally name the actual signatories as hostile actors. We will clear your name from the docket by the end of the week. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, I said. Do not thank me yet. Victor warned, his eyes narrowing slightly. When we file this motion, we expose the forgery to the court. The moment that evidence enters the public record, the plaintiff will pivot their crosshairs directly onto the individuals who actually executed the document. Your brother, and whoever aided him in forging your signature, will face the full financial wrath of Apex Holdings, followed shortly by a criminal inquiry from the state prosecutor. I understand the consequences, I replied. Victor nodded, satisfied with my resolve. He closed the blue folder and slid it back across the desk toward himself. Take the rest of the afternoon off, Adelaide, Victor instructed. Go visit your family. Serve them notice of exactly what is coming. Let them know that their quiet little clerical error has just initiated a war with the largest corporate defense firm in Delaware. I stood up from the leather chair. I felt lighter than I had in 25 years. I walked out of the managing partner's suite, retrieved my car keys from my office, and headed toward the elevator. It was time to go home. I merged onto the interstate, heading south, leaving the pristine glass and steel architecture of the financial district behind in my rearview mirror. The afternoon sky hung heavy and gray, a flat canvas of impending rain that matched the cold, methodical rhythm of my thoughts. The commute to my parents' suburban neighborhood typically took 40 minutes. I used every second of that drive to compartmentalize my emotions, packing them into tight sealed boxes, the same way I organized evidentiary exhibits for a complex trial. I was not a daughter driving home to seek comfort after a profound betrayal. I was a litigator traveling to a hostile deposition. The familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood looked exactly as they always had, lined with manicured lawns and quiet driveways that hid decades of curated dysfunction. I parked my sedan by the curb, retrieved the thick blue legal folder from the passenger seat, and walked up the concrete path. I did not knock. I unlocked the front door with my old key and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of lemon furniture polish and stale coffee. From the living room, I could hear the muted broadcast of a daytime sports debate show. I walked straight through the hallway and into the kitchen. My mother Linda was standing at the granite island organizing a stack of coupons. She looked up, her expression registering mild surprise at my unexpected midweek arrival. I did not offer a greeting. I placed the blue folder onto the center of the kitchen island. The heavy legal backing made a dull, authoritative thud against the polished stone. "What is this, Addie?" my mother asked, wiping her hands on a decorative dish towel. "It is a legal filing," I said, keeping my vocal register low and even. Apex Real Estate Holdings filed a formal complaint in the Court of Chancery yesterday. They are suing Connor for $200,000 in accelerated rent and punitive damages. They are also suing the personal guarantor who backed the commercial lease. Linda looked down at the blue folder, but did not reach for it. She offered a dismissive wave of her hand, a gesture she had perfected over decades of ignoring unpleasant realities. "Oh, that is just a clerical misunderstanding," she said, her tone bright and dangerously casual. "Connor told us the landlord was being difficult about the timeline. It will all blow over once he gets a few more clients booking studio time and catches up on the balance." "It is not a misunderstanding," I replied. "It is a targeted financial recovery effort by a major holding company, and my name is listed as the guarantor." My father walked into the kitchen, drawn by the unusual tension in the room. David had spent his entire professional life as a mid-level manager at a regional logistics firm. His primary survival strategy in the corporate world involved taking credit for his department's successes while seamlessly delegating his failures to his subordinates. He applied the exact same methodology to his parenting. He viewed Connor's chronic disasters as inevitable acts of nature, while he viewed my stability as a natural resource meant to be tapped whenever those disasters required funding. David looked at the blue folder on the counter, then looked at me. He did not show any signs of guilt or panic. He simply assessed the new logistical hurdle. "Well, you work for the firm representing the landlord," David said, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe. "You have access to the building. You know the partners handling the account. You just need to go into the office tomorrow and make it go away." I stared at him. I processed the sheer magnitude of his delusion, watching how effortlessly he expected me to compromise my ethics to shield his son. "Make it go away," I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the quiet kitchen air. "Yes," he said, nodding, as if he were giving a routine administrative directive. "Pull the file, tell your boss there was an error in the system, or just negotiate a quiet dismissal from the inside. You are a smart girl, Addie. You can squash this before it becomes a public issue for your brother. And if my firm refuses to drop a six-figure lawsuit just because I ask them to," I countered. "What is your contingency plan when the judge issues a summary judgment against my assets?" David sighed, adopting the exhausted posture of a reasonable man forced to deal with an uncooperative employee. "Then you just assume the liability yourself," he said. "You are making a premier corporate salary now. You have no dependents and no mortgage. You can easily cover the monthly installments without changing your lifestyle. Connor is just hitting a temporary rough patch. He needs a runway, and you have the capital to provide it." My mother stepped closer, placing a warm, patronizing hand on my forearm. "Family does not ruin family over paperwork," Linda insisted, her eyes wide with manufactured sincerity. "We all have to make sacrifices to support each other during hard times. That is what unconditional love is." I looked at the hand resting on my arm. I did not pull away. I simply observed it as a physical artifact of their manipulation. They did not see me as a daughter. They viewed me entirely as a reserve bank and emergency line of credit, designed to underwrite their golden child. A normal parent would feel deep shame for endangering their child's hard-earned career. My parents only felt annoyed that I was resisting the transaction. The betrayal was so profound it transcended anger. It became purely clinical. I did not yell. Raising my voice would signal that they still possessed the power to disrupt my internal equilibrium. In my profession, whoever loses their temper first loses the negotiation. Instead, I let a heavy, calculating silence stretch across the kitchen. I slipped my right hand into the open pocket of my leather tote bag resting on the stool beside me. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, my thumb found the side button of my smartphone. I swiped the screen by memory and tapped the center icon to activate the voice recording application. I felt the faint haptic vibration, confirming the microphone was live and capturing the ambient sound in the room. I need to understand the exact logistics of the exposure before I decide how to manage it from the inside, I said, maintaining a tone of pragmatic cooperation. When you copied my signature from my sophomore housing lease and took the document to the shipping center to get the fake notary stamp, did Connor know you were doing it, or did you act alone? Linda withdrew her hand from my arm, relaxing her posture now that she believed I was negotiating the terms of my own surrender. She fell into the trap with the ease of someone who believed she was entirely untouchable. Connor knew we were figuring out the guarantor requirement, she said, her voice clear and carrying perfectly toward the microphone hidden in my bag. But he did not know the specifics. Your father and I handled the actual cropping on the home computer. We paid the clerk at the shipping center in cash to stamp it without you being present. We just wanted to protect you from the stress of the details. We only did it because your brother needed that warehouse space to succeed. I left the blue folder on the granite island. I turned around and walked out the front door, leaving my parents to assume they had won the argument. I reached my car, locked the doors, and retrieved my phone from my bag. The screen displayed a pristine 3-minute audio file. I had the confession. I had the evidence. I possessed everything I needed to dismantle their entire world. The drive back to Wilmington took 40 minutes, and I used every second of it to transition from daughter to defense attorney. The sky finally broke open halfway down the interstate, unleashing a steady cold rain that slicked the pavement and turned the headlights of oncoming traffic into blurred streaks of white. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, controlling my breathing, letting the rhythmic hum of the tires ground me. I had the confession saved on my phone. The hardest part of the extraction was over. Now I needed to build the architecture of their ruin. I parked in the underground garage of the Delaware Trust building and took the private elevator up to the 32nd floor. Vanguard and Sterling at night was a different ecosystem than during the day. The frantic energy of paralegals and junior partners was gone, replaced by the quiet, sterile hum of the climate control system and the faint smell of floor wax. The empty hallways felt like a sanctuary. I walked to my corner office, closed the heavy glass door, and turned the deadbolt. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat in my ergonomic chair and woke my dual monitors, bathing the dark room in a pale blue glow. I plugged my smartphone into the computer and initiated a secure file transfer. I watched the progress bar fill as the 3-minute audio recording moved from my device onto an encrypted off-site cloud server. I labeled the file with a nondescript numeric code. Evidence requires redundancy. If I lost my phone, the confession would still exist pristine and ready to be entered into the record. With the audio secured, I began drafting the motion to sever. I approached the task with the cold, surgical precision I applied to corporate litigation. In Delaware, the legal threshold for piercing the corporate veil is exceptionally high. The Chancery Court respects the separation between a corporate entity and its individual members. To break that barrier, you must prove the entity is a sham, a vehicle constructed specifically to perpetrate a fraud. My parents had provided the exact mechanism needed to obliterate that veil. I needed to make my alibi undeniably solid, stripping away any potential counter-argument the plaintiff might attempt to leverage. A keycard swipe was strong evidence, but opposing counsel could argue. I had given my badge to a colleague while I sneaked out to a shipping center. I needed a human anchor. I opened the firm's internal archiving system and pulled the litigation files from the previous September. I navigated to the specific Tuesday stamped on the fraudulent notary seal. The date was September 24th. I scrolled through the index transcripts until I found the specific deposition I had attended that afternoon. It was a 10-hour marathon session involving a pharmaceutical merger. I opened the PDF of the certified court reporter transcript. I scanned the appearances page. My name was listed as secondary counsel. I scrolled deeper into the document, checking the timestamp margins. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the opposing counsel had objected to a line of questioning. The transcript showed that I had spoken on the record, citing a specific precedent to overrule the objection. The fraudulent notary stamp on Connor's commercial lease was dated 2:30 on that exact same afternoon. It was a physical impossibility for me to be arguing case law on the 32nd floor in Wilmington and simultaneously stamping a document in a suburban shipping center 40 miles away. I printed the relevant pages of the transcript, highlighted my spoken lines, and placed the sheets into the manila folder. The defense was now airtight. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation in my parents' kitchen was beginning to recede, leaving a sharp analytical clarity in its wake. I had protected myself. The motion to sever was ready to file. But a good litigator does not stop researching once they find their own defense. A good litigator audits the entire scope of the opposition's strategy to anticipate the fallout. Apex Real Estate Holdings was not a careless organization. They did not hand over prime commercial warehouse space to an unemployed musician solely because he presented a piece of paper with a guarantor signature. High-risk commercial leases always require tangible collateral. Connor possessed no assets. My signature provided the illusion of liquid capital, but a holding company would demand an underlying security interest. I opened a new browser window and logged into the Sussex County Recorder of Deeds database. I typed in my parents' home address and initiated a public records search. The system generated a list of recorded instruments tied to their suburban property. I expected to see their primary mortgage, which they had refinanced twice over the past decade to fund Connor's various misadventures. Instead, a new entry caught my attention. It was a deed of trust recorded just 3 days before the formation of Sonic Soundscapes. I paid the required municipal fee and downloaded the scanned document. I read the terms, and the true scope of my parents' desperation materialized on the screen. To secure the remainder of the commercial loan for the recording studio, David and Linda had quietly taken out a secondary lien on their house. They had pledged their home equity as collateral to Apex Real Estate Holdings, crossing the loan with the commercial lease. I sat in the dim light of my office, listening to the rain hit the floor-to-ceiling windows, and processed the devastating reality of what I had just uncovered. If I filed my motion to sever and expose the forged guarantor signature, the commercial lease would become voidable due to fraudulent inducement. Apex would immediately trigger the cross-default provisions written into the contract. They would not wait for Connor to generate revenue. They would execute their rights against the remaining collateral to recoup their losses. They would foreclose on the secondary lien. My parents would instantly lose their house. The weight of the discovery pressed down on my chest. I turned my chair to face the window, looking out over the dark, sprawling city of Wilmington. The streetlights reflected on the wet asphalt, creating long, distorted rivers of amber and red. I thought about the house in the suburbs. It was the physical embodiment of my family's curated respectability. It was the house where my mother hosted holiday parties, ensuring the silver was polished and the narrative was tightly controlled. It was the house where they dedicated the entire basement to Connor's drum kits and recording equipment, while I studied for the bar exam at a small desk crammed into the corner of the laundry room. They had spent my entire life prioritizing the preservation of that house, maintaining the facade of a successful, functional family for the benefit of the neighbors. Now they had wagered their most prized possession on Connor's inevitable failure, and they had attempted to use my stolen identity as the insurance policy to protect it. I held the power to ruin them. The ethical dilemma crystallized in the quiet space of my office. If I chose mercy, I would have to withdraw my evidence, assume the six-figure liability, and silently fund the very people who had forged my name. I would save their home, but I would effectively end my career. A corporate lawyer with a massive defaulted commercial judgment on her public record is a liability no firm will retain. My license, my reputation, and my financial independence would be sacrificed on the altar of family loyalty. If I chose justice, I would save myself. I would clear my name, preserve my standing at Vanguard and Sterling, and walk away clean. But the cost of that justice was total devastation for the people who raised me. Filing the motion was the equivalent of signing their eviction notice. I sat in the dark for a long time watching the rain streak the glass. I replayed the audio recording from the kitchen. I listened to my mother claim that family does not ruin family over paperwork, right after she admitted to committing a felony to trap me. I listened to my father suggest I risk disbarment to make his problem disappear. They did not view me as a human being. They viewed me as a structural support beam useful only for the weight I could carry. They had handed me a choice between my survival and theirs. I turned back to the monitors. I gathered the printed deposition transcripts, the keycard logs, and the deed of trust. I placed them all into the manila folder and closed the cover. The decision did not require emotion, it required a verdict. I drafted the final email to Victor Sterling, attaching the compiled evidence and requesting authorization to serve the motion to the plaintiff. I did not hesitate. I clicked send, feeling the cold final click of the mouse beneath my index finger. I chose myself. The Delaware Chancery Court operates on a digital docket. When you file a motion, there is no dramatic pounding of a gavel. There is only the quiet click of a computer mouse and a confirmation email stating your documents have been entered into the public record. On Friday morning, under the direct authorization of Victor Sterling, I uploaded a 50-page packet. It contained the motion to sever my name from the Apex Real Estate Holdings lawsuit. Attached as exhibits were the building access logs, the deposition transcripts, and the audio recording transcribed by a certified legal stenographer. In the concluding prayer for relief, I did not just ask the judge to dismiss me from the case. I filed a third-party complaint. I formally named David Vance, Linda Vance, and Connor Vance as hostile actors, accusing them of fraudulent inducement and forgery. I handed the plaintiff a detailed map of who had actually stolen their money, shifting the crosshairs of a six-figure debt collection directly onto my parents' suburban threshold. Once a motion is filed, the opposing parties must be served notice. You cannot mail a lawsuit of this magnitude. It requires personal service, a physical handover of the documents by a licensed professional to ensure the defendants cannot claim ignorance. In standard corporate litigation, you serve the registered agent at a business address. In this scenario, I hired a private process server and directed him to my childhood home. I gave him specific instructions regarding the timing. I requested he execute the delivery on Sunday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock. I chose that specific hour because Sundays at 2 o'clock were the cornerstone of my mother's social architecture. Every summer, Linda hosted a neighborhood barbecue. It was not a casual gathering of friends. It was a highly curated public relations event designed to project an image of suburban perfection to the rest of the cul-de-sac. She would spend 3 days marinating chicken, arranging floral centerpieces, and ensuring Connor's acoustic guitar was casually left on the patio so neighbors could ask about his burgeoning music career. During my adolescence, these barbecues were exhausting exercises in performative happiness. I was instructed to smile, serve iced tea, and remain quiet, while my parents exaggerated Connor's prospects to anyone who would listen. The barbecue was my mother's stage, and her reputation was the only currency she truly valued. I wanted the legal system to walk directly onto that stage. I spent my Sunday afternoon in my luxury apartment overlooking the Wilmington riverfront. The rain from earlier in the week had cleared, leaving a crisp, cloudless sky. I brewed a cup of dark roast coffee, sat at my kitchen island, and opened a legal brief for an upcoming merger. I did not pace. I did not bite my nails. I operated with the serene detachment of a litigator watching a carefully planned strategy unfold. At 2:15, my smartphone vibrated against the court's countertop. The caller ID displayed my mother's cell phone number. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the tension to settle before I picked up the device and pressed the green acceptance icon. "Hello," I said, keeping my vocal register flat and professional. There was no greeting. There was only the sound of rapid, ragged breathing followed by a voice tight with a level of panic I had never heard from her before. "What have you done?" Adelaide, my mother demanded. The polished, patronizing tone she normally employed was gone, replaced by a brittle, frantic edge. A man in a cheap suit just walked right up our driveway in front of the Millers and the Hendersons. He handed your father a stack of legal papers and announced that we were being sued for fraud, right in the middle of my patio. Everyone stopped talking. Everyone heard him. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "You were served with a third-party complaint and a summons," I explained, translating her humiliation into legal terminology. Apex Real Estate Holdings filed a motion against Connor. I filed a subsequent motion removing myself as the guarantor and presenting evidence that you and Dad forged my signature. The documents the process server handed you outline the exact timeline of the felony. "You sent a process server to my house during a party," Linda hissed, her voice cracking under the weight of her fractured pride. "You humiliated us in front of the entire neighborhood. Your father had to physically escort the man off the property. The Millers left without even saying goodbye. How could you do this to your own flesh and blood?" "I did not send him to humiliate you," I replied, staring out the window at the river. "I sent him to deliver the consequences of your own actions. You chose to commit a crime. The legal system dictates how you are notified of that crime. The guest list on your patio is irrelevant to the court." The line went silent for a few seconds. I could hear the faint sound of a door slamming in the background, likely my father retreating into the house to escape the stares of the neighbors. When my mother spoke again, her panic had hardened into a desperate, toxic hostility. She realized her authority was dissolving, so she reached for the only weapon she had left. She tried to make me the villain of a narrative she had written. "You are destroying this family over money you do not even need," Linda accused, her words dripping with a venomous entitlement. "You sit in your fancy office making a corporate salary, and you decide to ruin your brother's future and jeopardize our home over a simple clerical shortcut. You have no dependents, you have no real expenses. You could have easily absorbed those lease payments without noticing a difference in your lifestyle. Instead, you drag your own parents into a lawsuit. You are selfish, Adelaide. You have always been selfish." I listened to the tirade without interrupting. Her logic was a fascinating study in cognitive dissonance. In her mind, stealing my identity and saddling me with a six-figure debt was an act of familial loyalty, while my refusal to be financially ruined was an act of supreme selfishness. She genuinely believed my income was a communal asset meant to cover Connor's liabilities. She did not feel remorse for the forgery. She only felt anger that the forgery had failed. "You put a secondary line on your own house to secure a commercial lease for a son who has never held a job for more than 8 months," I stated, bringing the hidden truth into the light. "You gambled your primary residence on a guaranteed failure. When you realized the risk was too high, you decided to use my stolen signature as an insurance policy. You assumed I would pay off the commercial landlord to protect my career, shielding your home equity in the process." "We did what we had to do to protect our son," she snapped, abandoning any pretense of innocence. "And I did what I had to do to protect myself," I countered. "You are tearing us apart," Linda cried, her voice finally breaking. She was attempting to use tears to blur the boundary I had just drawn in concrete. "We are your family. You are tearing us apart over a piece of paper." I set my coffee mug down on the counter. The ceramic made a sharp, definitive sound against the stone. I did not raise my voice. I did not negotiate. I delivered the verdict. "A forged signature destroyed this family, Mom," I said. "I just refused to pay the ransom for it." I ended the call before she could formulate a response. I placed the phone face down on the island. The silence in my apartment returned deep and untroubled. I had severed the legal tie, but the structural collapse of my family was only just beginning. By transferring the liability back to its rightful owners, I had forced them to face the entity they feared most. I knew my mother would spend the rest of the evening blaming me, and my father would retreat into his cowardly silence. But Connor was a different variable. Connor had spent his entire life being shielded from the fallout of his own incompetence. Now his studio was collapsing, his parents were facing financial ruin, and the sister he had always viewed as a disposable resource had just handed him a bill he could not afford to pay. He would not retreat. He would panic. And panic always drives desperate people to make predictable mistakes. I picked up my legal brief and returned to my reading, knowing my brother's reaction was only a matter of time. Tuesday evening arrived with a biting chill off the river. I walked through the heavy glass doors of my apartment building, leaving the damp Wilmington air behind. The lobby of the residences at Riverfront was a quiet expanse of polished concrete, brushed steel, and ambient lighting. It was a fortress designed to keep the unpredictability of the city outside. The concierge, a retired police officer named Marcus, usually offered a polite nod as I headed for the private elevators. Tonight he stepped out from behind the mahogany desk and intercepted me. "Miss Vance," Marcus said, keeping his voice low and professional. "There is a gentleman waiting in the lounge area. He claims to be your brother. He bypassed security by following a resident through the secondary garage entrance. I was about to ask him to leave, but he matched the physical description you provided for your guest registry." I glanced toward the seating area. Connor was pacing near a gas fireplace that offered aesthetic warmth but no actual heat. He looked remarkably out of place among the imported Italian leather sofas and curated modern art. He wore a faded flannel shirt and denim jeans that had been intentionally distressed, a curated poverty aesthetic funded by our parents' dwindling retirement accounts. He was 28 years old, yet he carried the frantic, unmoored energy of a teenager caught skipping school. "Thank you, Marcus," I said. "He is my brother. I will handle it." I walked across the polished floor. Connor stopped pacing when he saw me approach. For a brief moment, the arrogant smirk he usually wore during our Sunday dinners flickered across his face, an old reflex born from decades of getting his way. But the smirk died quickly, replaced by a pale, hollow desperation. The reality of the Chancery Court docket had finally breached his curated reality. "Addie," Connor said, taking a quick step toward me. His voice held a manufactured tremor, a specific tactic he used whenever he needed our parents to open their wallets. "We need to talk. This whole situation has gone way too far." I did not offer him a seat. I stood near the edge of the seating area, maintaining a calculated physical distance between us. I did not ask him how he bypassed the garage security. "We have nothing to discuss, Connor," I replied. "The legal filings are a matter of public record. You can read the motion to sever. It contains all the relevant details regarding the forgery and the subsequent third-party complaint." Connor ran a hand through his unkempt hair, letting out an exasperated sigh. He attempted to adopt the posture of a reasonable mediator dealing with a difficult client. "You are overreacting." "Addie," he pleaded, lowering his voice as a resident walked past us toward the mailroom. "Mom and Dad are practically having nervous breakdowns. The landlord sent a default notice to the studio today, and now they are threatening to foreclose on the house. Mom has not stopped crying since Sunday. You cannot just throw our own parents to the wolves over a signature." I looked at him. I examined his posture, his tone, his carefully constructed performance of distress. He was attempting to transfer the guilt of the crime onto the victim of the crime. During my freshman year of high school, Connor borrowed my laptop without asking, downloaded a corrupted file that destroyed my final history project, and then blamed me for not installing better security software. My parents agreed with him, suggesting I was being careless with shared resources. When he crashed his first car, he told the police the brakes failed. The mechanic later proved Connor had simply ignored the dashboard warning light for 2 years. My parents paid the mechanic to stop discussing the negligence and bought Connor a more expensive vehicle. He never learned to read a dashboard. He only learned that if he ignored a warning light long enough, someone else would buy him a new car. He had spent his entire life expecting me to absorb the consequences of his recklessness. "I did not forge the signature, Connor," I stated, keeping my tone devoid of emotion. "I did not cross-collateralize a commercial lease with a residential deed of trust. The people who committed those acts are the ones facing the consequences." Connor took another step forward, dropping the mediator facade and leaning heavily into the role of the victim. "I did not know they stole your signature," he insisted, his eyes wide with a practiced innocence. "I swear to you, Addie, I just told them I needed a guarantor to secure the space for the studio. They told me they would handle the paperwork. I never asked them to break the law. You have to believe me." I analyzed his defense. It was the same defense he used when he totaled his car and claimed ignorance of the mechanics. He always positioned himself as a passive passenger in his own life, claiming ignorance whenever a bill came due. Ignorance is not innocence, I said. It is a subscription you chose to maintain. You knew you possessed zero assets and terrible credit. You knew no legitimate commercial landlord would hand you the keys to a warehouse without a solvent backer. You deliberately chose not to ask how our parents magically satisfied that requirement, because knowing the truth would obligate you to take responsibility. You preferred the comfort of the lie. Connor flinched. The blunt truth hit him like a physical blow, but his self-preservation instincts quickly overrode his shame. He resorted to bargaining. Okay, fine, he conceded, throwing his hands up in a gesture of frantic surrender. Maybe I should have asked more questions. I admit that. But you have to withdraw this filing, Addie. Just go to your boss and tell him you changed your mind. Tell him it was a family arrangement and you are assuming the debt. I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his request settle into the quiet lobby. He was asking me to assume a $200,000 liability for a business that was already failing. And why would I agree to financially ruin myself for a studio that cannot generate rent, I asked. Because I will pay you back eventually. Connor promised, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of profound insincerity. Once the studio gets off the ground, once I book a few more bands, I will reimburse every single cent. I just need time. But if you let this lawsuit proceed, they take the studio, they take the house, and I end up with a judgment on my record. You are the only one who can fix this. You make a corporate salary. You can take the hit. I observed my older brother. He was 28 years old, yet he stood before me as an infant, demanding that I step into the line of fire to shield him from a reality he created. He honestly believed my income existed solely to fund his delays. He thought my career was a safety net, designed to catch him every time he jumped without a parachute. If I saved him now, I would not be rescuing him. I would be enabling a terminal disease. I would be confirming that his actions held no weight and that he could continue to drift through life, leaving a wake of destruction for me to clean up. I will not withdraw the motion, I said. Addie, please, Connor begged, his voice cracking. You are going to make us homeless. I am doing nothing, I corrected him. I am simply stepping out of the way. I spent 25 years standing between you and the consequences of your actions. I am no longer playing that role. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as his mind scrambled for a new tactic. The panic in his eyes was genuine now. The realization was finally penetrating his curated armor. The golden boy was standing in a polished concrete lobby, fully exposed to the elements. You are cold. Adelaide, Connor spat, his fear transforming into a bitter, venomous anger. You are a cold, heartless corporate machine. You do not care about anyone but yourself. I did not defend my warmth. I did not argue about who possessed a heart. In the realm of legal liability, emotions are irrelevant distractions. You can hurl insults at me until you lose your voice, Connor, I replied, turning my body toward the elevator bank. It will not change the docket. The plaintiff has the evidence. The judge has the motion. The deposition is scheduled for next week. I suggest you stop pacing in my lobby and start looking for a defense attorney who accepts payment plans. I walked away, leaving him standing near the artificial fire. He called my name once, a sharp, desperate sound that echoed off the brushed steel walls, but I did not turn around. I pressed the call button for the private elevator and watched the floor indicator light descend. For 28 years, Connor had lived a life subsidized by other people, sacrificing their own stability. He had dined on our parents' retirement funds, slept under a roof. They mortgaged twice and attempted to build a business on my stolen identity. He had never once picked up a check. But as I stepped into the elevator and the heavy doors slid shut, sealing him out of my sanctuary, I felt a profound sense of closure. The free ride was officially over. For the first time in his life, the bill had arrived in his name. The deposition room on the 38th floor of Vanguard and Sterling was designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous expanse of glass-brushed steel and polished walnut. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the Wilmington skyline, a visual reminder to anyone sitting at the table that they were operating inside a fortress of capital and consequence. The ambient temperature was kept intentionally low, chilling the air to keep the occupants alert and uncomfortable. I sat on one side of the long conference table. My posture was rigid, my hands folded neatly over a fresh legal pad. Sitting directly beside me was Victor Sterling. He wore a dark navy suit and projected a lethal, unbothered calm. He was not here as a managing partner today. He was here acting as my personal counsel. Across the expanse of walnut sat my family. They looked incredibly small. For my entire life, my parents had controlled the environment. They set the rules of engagement in our suburban kitchen, dictating the volume of the conversation and deciding whose reality was valid. They were accustomed to home field advantage. Here, surrounded by the sharp angles of corporate litigation, their curated authority evaporated. My father David wore a gray suit that was 10 years out of date, the shoulders slightly too wide, the lapels frayed at the edges. He kept adjusting his tie, his eyes darting toward the digital recording equipment set up in the corner. Connor sat next to him wearing a button-down shirt that he had clearly ironed in a panic, leaving stiff creases near the collar. He looked pale, nursing a styrofoam cup of water and staring at the grain of the wood. For a man who usually commanded the center of attention with his artistic grievances, Connor was remarkably silent. The impending threat of financial ruin had stripped away his bohemian arrogance, leaving only a frightened debtor. And then there was my mother. Linda had dressed for a social event, not a legal proceeding. She wore a pastel cardigan and a string of pearls, attempting to bring her neighborhood barbecue persona into a room built for hostile cross-examinations. She smiled at the certified court reporter, a young woman setting up a stenotype machine at the head of the table. Linda was still operating under the delusion that charm could override a subpoena. She believed that if she just explained the situation nicely enough, the wealthy lawyers would realize this was all a silly overreaction. She had spent decades managing school principals, local bank tellers, and nosy neighbors. She failed to comprehend that a chancery court deposition does not yield to suburban pleasantries. The court reporter finished calibrating her machine. She asked David, Linda, and Connor to raise their right hands. The swearing-in process is a mundane ritual to those in the profession, but to a civilian, it carries a heavy, undeniable gravity. They swore to tell the truth under penalty of perjury. The air in the room shifted. They were no longer speaking in a living room where lies could be swept under a rug. Every syllable they uttered was now entering the official legal record. Victor opened a sleek leather portfolio. He extracted a single sheet of paper and placed it face down on the table. We are here on the record regarding the matter of Apex Real Estate Holdings versus Sonic Soundscapes and the named guarantors. Victor began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that commanded immediate silence. I am Victor Sterling, representing Adelaide Vance. We are conducting this deposition to clarify the origin of the signature appearing on the commercial lease agreement entered into evidence as Exhibit A. Before Victor could ask his first question, my mother leaned forward. She rested her forearms on the table, adopting the warm, condescending tone she used to placate angry high school teachers when Connor failed his exams. Mr. Sterling, if I may just say something first, Linda interrupted, offering a practiced maternal smile. I know this all looks very serious with the recorders and the lawyers, but I want to assure you, this is just a family misunderstanding. Adelaide is a wonderful girl, but she tends to view things in black and white. She gets that from her father. We are a close family. We always help each other out. We just had a little miscommunication about the paperwork for Connor's studio. We certainly do not need to waste your valuable time dragging this out into a formal lawsuit. I watched her perform. For 25 years, that exact tone had successfully minimized my achievements, dismissed my boundaries, and rewritten history to suit her comfort. When I was passed over for a lead role in a school play because the director favored a donor's child, my mother told me not to view things in black and white. When Connor stole my graduation money to buy recording equipment, she called it a family misunderstanding. She expected Victor to soften. She expected him to recognize her as a respectable suburban matriarch who simply made a tiny error in judgment out of love for her son. Victor did not smile. He did not blink. He looked at my mother with the clinical detachment of an entomologist studying a common insect. Mrs. Vance, Victor said, his voice dropping the temperature in the room by another 10 degrees. You are not hosting a brunch. You are sitting in a deposition room facing allegations of felony wire fraud and identity theft. The plaintiff is seeking over $200,000 in damages. If you attempt to reframe a federal crime as a family miscommunication again, I will conclude this deposition and we will reconvene in a criminal courtroom with the state prosecutor. Do you understand the severity of your current position? The maternal smile fell off my mother's face. The sudden absence of her curated warmth left her looking stark and terrified. She opened her mouth to argue, realized she had no leverage, and slowly closed it. She nodded once, a rigid, jerky motion. Please answer audibly for the court reporter, Victor instructed, unyielding in his enforcement of protocol. Yes, Linda whispered, her gaze dropping to her folded hands. I understand. Victor turned his attention away from her, shifting his focus to the weakest structural point in their defense. He looked at my father. David had spent decades hiding behind my mother's aggressive management style, allowing her to take the lead while he enjoyed the benefits of her manipulation. He was a man who avoided direct conflict at all costs. Victor knew how to dismantle a coward. You do not attack their pride. You trap them in a corner where lying carries a higher penalty than telling the truth. Mr. Vance, Victor said, addressing my father directly. Let us discuss the mechanics of the lease execution. I am projecting Exhibit A onto the screen behind me. Victor pressed a button on a small remote control. The mechanized blinds covering the interior glass walls descended, plunging the room into a dim twilight. A high-resolution projector hummed to life, illuminating the blank wall behind my family with a massive 10-foot image of the final page of Connor's commercial lease. My forged signature sat bold and undeniable on the guarantor line, amplified for everyone in the room to scrutinize. Seeing it projected at that scale made the violation feel intensely physical. That signature represented years of my disciplined choices, my financial prudence, and my hard-fought independence. They had stolen it to prop up a lie. According to the metadata embedded in the electronic filing provided by the commercial landlord, this document was not submitted physically, Victor explained, pacing his words with rhythmic, agonizing precision. The lease was executed through a secure digital portal. The portal requires the user to upload the scanned document and certify its authenticity before hitting the submission key. Doing so transmits an Internet Protocol address to the receiving server. We have subpoenaed the Internet service provider linked to that transmission. My father swallowed hard. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin an unhealthy pallid gray. He glanced sideways at my mother, desperately searching for a script, a cue, a way out of the snare. Linda stared straight ahead, frozen in the headlights of the impending collision. Mr. Vance, Victor continued, his tone devoid of mercy, you are currently under oath. Perjury in this state carries a mandatory prison sentence. I want you to look at the document on the screen. Then I want you to look at the court reporter and state exactly whose residential IP address was used to upload that forged signature to the landlord's server on the afternoon of September 24th. The silence in the boardroom stretched until it felt fragile, ready to snap under the immense pressure. I watched my father grip the edge of the walnut table. His knuckles turned white. He was doing the mental arithmetic, calculating the cost of protecting his wife versus the cost of facing a perjury charge and potential incarceration. He had spent his entire life choosing the path of least resistance. Standing by his family was no longer the easy route. The bill for his passive complicity had finally arrived. David opened his mouth, his gaze darting frantically around the cold, intimidating room as the carefully constructed facade of the Vance family began to show its first irreversible fractures. The silence in the boardroom was no longer just quiet. It possessed a physical weight, pressing down on the walnut table and suffocating the remaining oxygen. David looked at the projected image of my forged signature. Then he looked at Victor. My father was a man who had navigated his entire existence by locating the nearest emergency exit. When the pressure mounted, he always found a way to slip out the side door, leaving someone else to extinguish the fire. Today, the only available exit required him to step directly over his wife. It was our home network, David said. His voice was a thin, reedy whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, speaking toward the court reporter's typing hands rather than making eye contact with anyone in the room. The internet provider is registered under my name. The upload originated from our residential router. Victor leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Establishing the location is a helpful first step, Mr. Vance. Now we require the specific operator, who physically sat at the computer, logged into the commercial landlord's digital portal, and uploaded the forged instrument. David swallowed hard. He cast a fleeting, desperate glance toward Linda. She stared back at him, her eyes wide with a silent, frantic warning. For a quarter of a century, they had maintained an unspoken pact. She managed the optics and he provided the quiet compliance. But perjury carried a state prison sentence. My father's loyalty expired the moment his own freedom was threatened. It was Linda, David confessed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. She is the one who scanned the old college lease. She cropped Adelaide's signature using a photo editing program. I told her it was a terrible idea, but she insisted we had to secure the warehouse space before Connor lost his deposit. She clicked the submission button. Linda recoiled as if she had been struck. The suburban matriarch facade shattered, leaving behind a terrified, cornered woman. The betrayal registered on her face in sharp, jagged lines. Her husband, the man whose passivity she had relied upon to execute her schemes, had just handed her over to a corporate litigator to save himself. "David, how could you say that?" Linda gasped, her voice trembling with indignation. She turned her panicked gaze toward Victor, desperately attempting to construct a new narrative from the ruins of the old one. "He is twisting the facts. I only handled the technical aspects because I am better with computers. But I never would have submitted a legal document without permission. Connor assured us we had verbal consent." She pivoted her entire body toward my brother, transferring the liability with ruthless efficiency. "Connor told us Adelaide agreed to back the studio," Linda claimed, pointing a manicured finger at her son. "He sat at our kitchen table and promised us he had spoken to his sister. He said Adelaide knew all about the guarantor requirements, but she was simply too busy with her new law firm job to deal with the tedious paperwork. He said she authorized us to handle the digital submission on her behalf. We were just acting as administrative proxies for our children. We thought we were helping." The deposition room became an arena where the family turned on itself, each member desperately searching for a scapegoat. I watched them cannibalize their own curated image. They were no longer a supportive, unified front. They were three individuals drowning in a sinking ship, fighting over a single life preserver. Connor dropped his styrofoam cup. Water spilled across the polished walnut, pooling around his legal pad. The shock of being framed by his own mother wiped away his frightened demeanor. The entitled, resentful brother I had known my entire life finally surfaced raw and unfiltered. "Are you kidding me right now?" Connor shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are trying to pin a felony on me. I never told you she gave verbal consent. I never even brought it up to her because I knew she would just give me another condescending lecture about financial responsibility." "Connor, please lower your voice," Linda hissed, glancing nervously at the court reporter. "You are on the record." "I do not care about the record," Connor shot back, rising halfway out of his leather chair. He glared at his mother, then turned his fury toward me. The mask was gone. The struggling artist routine vanished, exposing the bitter entitlement simmering underneath. "I knew you forged it," Connor admitted, throwing his hands up in frustration. "Of course I knew. I saw the finalized lease. I saw her name on the bottom line. I knew she never would have signed it voluntarily. But I let you do it because I needed the space, and frankly, I did not care how you secured it." He leaned across the table, his eyes locked onto mine. There was no remorse in his expression, only a toxic, deeply ingrained resentment. "Adelaide owes us," Connor sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "She has coasted through life being the easy one. She got the scholarships, the elite job, the fancy apartment. Everything just falls right into her lap while the rest of us scrape by. She makes more money in a month than I make in a year. She could have easily absorbed the cost of that lease without breaking a sweat. It is about time she paid her fair share to this family, instead of looking down her nose at us." The truth hung in the chilled air of the boardroom. It was not a complex corporate conspiracy. It was a simple, brutal entitlement. They believed my success was a communal asset and my boundaries were merely obstacles to be bypassed. I sat in my chair and watched them unravel. I did not feel the need to argue. I did not feel a sudden urge to defend my hard work or justify my financial independence. I felt a profound settling peace. For years I had believed that I needed to fight them to protect my future. Sitting in that room observing them betray each other, under the mildest application of legal pressure, I realized I never had to destroy my family. The truth accomplished the demolition for me. Their entire dynamic was built on a foundation of lies, enabling, and mutual exploitation. Once the external pressure became too great, the architecture collapsed inward. Victor allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment, ensuring the court reporter captured every damning syllable of their self-destruction. He did not interrupt their infighting. He merely let them provide all the necessary evidence to secure our victory. The record will reflect that all three respondents have confessed to possessing prior knowledge of or direct involvement in the fraudulent execution of the commercial lease. Victor stated, his voice slicing through the remaining tension. He reached into his leather portfolio and retrieved a crisp single-page document bearing the official seal of the Delaware Court of Chancery. He placed it on the table and slid it across the walnut surface until it rested in front of my mother. "This is a certified court order signed by the presiding judge at 8 o'clock this morning," Victor explained. "Based on the digital forensics and the geographical alibi we submitted earlier this week, the court has granted our motion. Adelaide Vance is hereby severed from the Apex Real Estate Holdings lawsuit with prejudice. Her name has been permanently cleared from the docket. The plaintiff has formally dropped all claims against her." My parents stared at the document. The realization washed over them, extinguishing the last remnants of their hope. I was no longer a party to the lawsuit. I was no longer their shield. The plaintiff is now pursuing the remaining defendants for the full balance of the accelerated rent, the punitive damages, and the legal fees. Victor continued, his gaze drifting toward the projection of the forged signature on the wall. "Apex is fully aware that the commercial lease is tied to a secondary lien on your residential property. They are initiating foreclosure proceedings on your home by the end of the week." My father buried his face in his hands. Connor sank back into his chair, staring blankly at the spilled water on the table. My mother looked at me, her eyes wide with a hollow, devastated clarity. The ransom they tried to force me to pay had just bankrupted them instead. I had survived the collision, but the final terms of their surrender were still waiting to be delivered. The silence that followed the judge's order was heavy and final. Victor Sterling closed his leather portfolio and folded his hands, signaling that his role as the primary architect of their defeat was complete. The defense had crumbled. The perjury trap had worked flawlessly. My parents and my brother sat in a stunned, breathless void, staring at the physical proof that their most reliable asset had just evaporated. For 25 years, they had utilized my stability as a buffer against the harsh realities of their own poor decisions. Now they were staring directly at the incoming impact. In a standard corporate dispute, this is the phase where the victorious party offers a negotiated settlement to mitigate further damages and avoid a prolonged trial. I was not interested in mitigation. I was interested in a permanent quarantine. I reached into my briefcase and retrieved a thin stack of documents printed on heavy archival paper. During my childhood, resolving a conflict always meant conceding my own boundaries to accommodate Connor. If he broke a neighbor's window with a baseball, I was asked to forfeit my allowance to help pay the repair bill. If he missed his curfew, I was grounded for failing to remind him to come home. Compromise in the Vance household was a unilateral transaction where I paid the penalty for his infractions. My mother called it keeping the peace. It was actually a systematic training program designed to teach me that my comfort was always secondary to my brother's convenience. Today, the negotiation table operated under my rules, and I intended to enforce a strict zero-tolerance policy. I placed the documents in the center of the walnut table and slid them across the polished wood. They came to a halt directly in front of my father. "Apex Real Estate Holdings has their ruling," I stated, keeping my vocal register clinical and detached. "But we are not finished. You attempted to tether my financial identity to a failing enterprise without my consent. I am legally removing your ability to ever attempt that maneuver again." The papers sitting in front of you outline the terms of a final non-negotiable settlement agreement between myself and the three of you. David looked down at the paperwork, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. Connor refused to look at the documents, opting to stare at the wall with a sullen, resentful glare. I did not wait for them to process the introductory clauses. I articulated the first condition. Effective immediately, you will initiate the formal dissolution of Sonic Soundscapes, I said. You will liquidate whatever assets remain in that warehouse to offset the landlord's judgment. You will sell the mixing boards, the microphones, and the soundproofing equipment. Furthermore, you will sign an acknowledgement assuming sole and exclusive liability for the entirety of the commercial debt, the default interest, and the plaintiff's legal fees. I will not tolerate any future attempts to claim I hold a fractional responsibility for this disaster. The debt belongs to the people who forged the instrument. I leaned forward and turned the page to the second condition, ensuring the bold heading was visible to all three of them. Attached to the liability transfer is a perpetual cease and desist order, I continued. It is an ironclad injunction. By signing it, you are legally prohibited from ever using my name, my social security number, my likeness, or my professional credentials in any capacity. You will not list me as an emergency contact on a medical form. You will not reference my employment at Vanguard Sterling to secure a bank loan or a line of credit. You will not attempt to open a utility bill, a residential lease, or a credit card using my identity. The severance is total and immediate. If a credit bureau flags an inquiry originating from your household, it will be treated as a violation of a court order. Connor scoffed, a bitter, cynical sound that echoed in the chilled boardroom. He crossed his arms over his chest, clinging to a desperate, unearned arrogance. And if we refuse to sign your ridiculous demands, Connor sneered. We are already losing the house to the landlord. Mom and Dad are broke. My studio is ruined. What else can you possibly take from us? I can take your freedom, I replied. I nodded toward the court reporter at the head of the table. She had just finished logging the digital transcript of the session, her fingers resting lightly on the stenotype machine keys. Everything you confessed to this morning is now a certified legal record given under oath, I explained, making sure my enunciation was perfectly clear. If you decline my settlement terms, Mr. Sterling and I will walk this transcript directly to the Delaware Attorney General's office. We will hand the state prosecutor a pristine recorded confession of felony wire fraud, perjury, and identity theft. The state does not offer convenient payment plans for those offenses. The state offers mandatory minimum sentences. You will not just lose the suburban house. You will lose years of your lives in a state penitentiary. The threat of prison broke the final remnants of my mother's composure. The polished neighborhood barbecue persona shattered entirely. She began to weep. It was not the calculated performative crying she used to manipulate school principals or deflect accountability during our Sunday dinners. It was the visceral, ugly weeping of a woman who had finally run out of exits and realized the walls were closing in. She reached across the polished wood, her hands shaking with a severe tremor, and grasped the edge of the settlement papers. "Adelaide, please, Linda," sobbed, tears ruining her carefully applied makeup and streaking down her face. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot threaten your own parents with prison. We made a mistake. We were desperate to help your brother, but we are blood. You cannot erase us with a piece of paper. Family is forever. You have to remember who we are and where you came from." I looked at the woman who had spent 2 decades treating my loyalty as an unlimited resource to be harvested. I searched my chest for a trace of guilt, a flicker of daughterly obligation, or a hesitation born of nostalgia. I found a profound, sweeping emptiness where her influence used to reside. They had forged my signature, gambled my career, and blamed me for the fallout. They had engineered their own destruction and expected me to act as the blast shield. Now, facing the consequences of their own arrogance, they wanted to hide behind a biological technicality. I rested my forearms on the table and met her tear-filled gaze with absolute stillness. "This isn't blood, Mom," I said, my voice echoing clearly and decisively across the boardroom. "It is a binding contract. Sign it." Linda stared at me, her eyes darting across my face, searching for a trace of the compliant, quiet girl she had raised. She found nothing but a corporate litigator enforcing a penalty clause. Her shoulders collapsed, curving inward as the last drop of her leverage evaporated into the cold air. She picked up the black ink pen resting beside the legal pad. Her hand trembled as she applied her signature to the bottom of the first page. She did not argue further. She simply surrendered. She passed the pen to my father. David accepted it without a word. He signed the documents with the resigned mechanical speed of a defeated man who was grateful simply to avoid a prison cell. He slid the papers across the table to Connor. My brother glared at me, his eyes burning with an impotent, humiliated fury. He wanted to throw the pen. He wanted to scream about the unfairness of the universe. But the threat of the state prosecutor loomed too large. He scrawled his name across the guarantor release line, pressing so hard the ink nearly tore through the thick archival paper. Victor reached across the table and gathered the signed contracts. He checked each signature page, verifying the execution, and closed his leather portfolio. The transaction was complete. I had forced them to internalize the full weight of their choices. They were leaving the building with a foreclosed future, carrying a commercial debt they could not outrun, and a legal injunction they could not breach. The deposition had formally concluded, but the natural consequences of their surrender were already waiting for them outside the glass walls. The legal system does not operate with the sudden dramatic speed portrayed in television broadcasts. It operates like a glacier. It is slow, methodical, and entirely indifferent to the terrain it crushes as it moves forward. Once the settlement agreement was signed and entered into the record, my daily involvement with my family ceased. I did not receive panicked phone calls in the middle of the night. I did not receive guilt-ridden text messages during my morning commute. The perpetual cease and desist order acted as an impenetrable firewall, severing the toxic connection that had defined my life. Without my income, acting as a structural dampener, the financial impact of Connor's defaulted commercial lease struck my parents with full force. Apex Real Estate Holdings did not harbor any sentimental attachment to my childhood home. To a holding company, a secondary lien is simply an asset waiting to be liquidated. The default triggered the foreclosure protocols. My parents were given a standard grace period to satisfy the $200,000 debt. Since they had exhausted their savings covering Connor's previous failures, they possessed no liquid capital to meet the demand. They were forced to list the house on the open market. I learned about the sale not through a tearful family meeting, but through a standard real estate alert I set up on a property website. Seeing the listing photos provided a surreal, detached viewing experience. I scrolled through the digital gallery of the suburban colonial where I had spent 18 years being trained to disappear. There was the formal dining room where I was told to stop discussing my debate tournaments. There was the finished basement, still displaying the acoustic foam panels from Connor's various musical phases, the very projects that had drained my college fund. The real estate agent described it as a charming starter home with excellent entertainment potential. To me, it was a museum of unearned entitlement, and the doors were finally closing. The property sold quickly to a young couple moving out of the city. My parents used the equity to pay off the commercial landlord and satisfy the outstanding legal fees. They moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the county. The sprawling backyard and the curated patio where my mother hosted her neighborhood barbecues were gone. Connor faced a similarly steep descent into reality. Sonic soundscapes dissolved not with a tragic artistic finale, but with a sterile bankruptcy filing. Stripped of his recording studio and his parental subsidies, his indie band fractured. Musicians require rehearsal space, equipment maintenance, and promotional funding. Connor could provide none of those things. His bandmates, realizing the financial well, had permanently dried up, quietly abandoned the project to seek stable employment. For the first time in 28 years, Connor was forced to enter the unskilled labor market. He secured a position at a regional hardware store organizing inventory in the plumbing aisle. His new reality did not involve late-night recording sessions or sleeping until noon. It involved a polyester uniform, a time card, and a manager who did not care about his creative process. He had to wake up at 5 a.m, commute on public transit, because he could no longer afford his car insurance, and report to a shift supervisor who was 5 years his junior. During my childhood, whenever I complained about the exhaustion of working double shifts at the campus library, Connor would roll his eyes and tell me I lacked a visionary mindset. Now the visionary was spending 40 hours a week scanning barcodes and stocking PVC pipes just to make the minimum payments on his remaining legal penalties. My mother, true to her nature, could not accept this sudden downward mobility in silence. Linda required an audience, and she required a villain to explain her circumstances. She attempted to launch a comprehensive public relations campaign within her social circles. She sat in the pews of her local church and stood in the checkout lines of the suburban grocery stores, weaving a tragic narrative of corporate greed. She told the neighbors that Vanguard and Sterling had corrupted me. She spun a story where I had turned my back on my own flesh and blood, sacrificing my family's home to impress the wealthy partners at my elite firm. She painted herself as the devoted, heartbroken matriarch, ruined by a ruthless, ungrateful daughter. She tried to weaponize pity, a tool she had wielded with precision for decades. In previous years, this strategy would have succeeded. My mother was a master at monopolizing the narrative because she always spoke first and loudest. However, she failed to account for the modern transparency of the Delaware legal system. The Chancery Court maintains a public, easily searchable electronic docket. It did not take long for the truth to surface. A member of her book club, a retired paralegal with a penchant for neighborhood gossip, decided to verify the rumors. She accessed the court portal and downloaded the third-party complaint, the digital forensics report, and the finalized settlement agreement. The official document circulated through the cul-de-sac faster than any rumor. The neighbors read the sworn affidavits. They saw the undeniable proof of the forged signature and the meticulous timeline of the identity theft. The neighborhood discovered that the respectable, devoted parents next door had committed felony fraud to subsidize a failing musician and had attempted to frame their own daughter for the debt. The social evaporation was swift and total. The invitations to summer garden parties stopped arriving. The polite conversations at the local coffee shop turned into awkward, hurried departures whenever my mother approached. Linda had spent her entire adult life curating an image of upper-middle-class perfection, hiding every flaw behind a wall of relentless positivity. When the community read the raw, unfiltered court transcripts, that wall collapsed. They were not viewed as victims of corporate greed. They were exposed as predators who had been caught. I observed the fallout from a comfortable distance, tracking the developments through the occasional unsolicited updates forwarded by old acquaintances. I experienced no gloating. I felt no triumphant thrill at their downsizing. Gloating requires a lingering emotional investment, a desire to see the opposing parties suffer. I only desired peace. I processed their dissent with the detached acceptance of a lawyer closing a resolved case file. The dispute was settled, the liabilities were distributed to the correct parties, and the ledger was finally balanced. My apartment remained a quiet, orderly sanctuary. The silence was not lonely. It was the sound of a neutralized threat. The profound realization that settled over me during those quiet months was the simplicity of their ruin. I did not have to engineer a complex scheme to destroy them. I did not have to raise my voice, hurl insults, or engage in bitter retaliation. I simply stopped preventing their destruction. For 2.5 decades, I had acted as the structural support beam holding up a decaying building. When I finally stepped out of the way, the gravity of their own choices pulled the roof down on their heads. They engineered their own collapse by assuming the foundation would never shift. As the dust settled in the suburbs, my professional landscape in Wilmington began to shift. The severance of my family ties had cleared the cognitive clutter from my mind, allowing me to pour a pristine, undivided focus into my caseload at Vanguard and Sterling. My billable hours increased, my strategic insights sharpened, and my ability to navigate high-stakes negotiations caught the attention of the executive committee. The partners had watched me handle a personal crisis with the exact stoic ruthlessness required to thrive in this industry. The trial of my personal life had ended, but the verdict was about to yield an unexpected professional dividend. 2 years dissolved into the relentless, demanding tempo of Delaware corporate law. I am 27 years old. The calendar pages turned marked not by suburban holidays or manufactured family crises, but by quarterly earnings, appellate rulings, and the quiet satisfaction of closing a meticulously negotiated merger. The silence left by my parents' absence acted as a fertile soil. Without the constant drain of their emotional tax, my bandwidth expanded. I billed hours that eclipsed my peers. I drafted indemnification clauses that shielded multinational conglomerates from nine-figure liabilities. The energy I once spent mitigating Connor's disasters was now channeled directly into my own upward trajectory. My career was no longer a side note in a suburban kitchen. It was the entire architecture of my daily existence. In the autumn of my second year, Vanguard and Sterling handed me the lead associate role on a contentious proxy battle involving a logistics holding company. The opposing counsel utilized hostile scorched earth tactics, attempting to intimidate our board members with frivolous discovery requests and bad faith depositions. 5 years ago, under the conditioning of my mother's regime, I might have sought a compromise to keep the peace. Instead, I systematically dismantled their filings. I cross-referenced their evidentiary claims against federal transportation statutes, exposing a pattern of regulatory violations that rendered their hostile bid void. I did not raise my voice in the negotiation room. I simply handed them the paper trail and watched their leverage evaporate. The lead partner on the opposing side offered a tight, defeated nod. I recognized that nod. It was the same surrender I saw in the Chancery deposition room. On a crisp, Thursday morning in late November, the internal phone on my desk chimed. It was Eleanor Victor Sterling's executive assistant. Her tone held the brisk, efficient cadence of someone managing the apex of the firm. "Mr. Sterling requests your presence in his office," Adelaide Eleanor said, "at your earliest convenience." 2 years prior, a summons to the top floor induced a clinical chilling focus, signaling an impending collision between my professional license and my family's fraud. Today, my pulse remained steady. I closed the prospectus I was reviewing, aligned my pen parallel to my legal pad, and walked toward the elevator bank. My heels struck the marble floors with a measured, confident rhythm. I had spent 24 months proving my yield to this firm. I carried no hidden debts. The heavy oak doors of the managing partner's suite stood open. Victor sat behind his sprawling mahogany desk, reviewing a leather-bound brief. He looked up as I entered, gesturing toward the guest chairs. The room retained its familiar scent of old paper and quiet authority. "Take a seat," Adelaide Victor instructed, closing the brief and folding his hands over the cover. I sat down, maintaining the upright, attentive posture of a litigator ready for inquiry. The executive committee convened this morning to review the quarterly performance metrics. Victor began, his voice carrying its usual resonant gravity. "Your handling of the logistics proxy battle was exemplary. You navigated a volatile opposing counsel with a stoicism that is rare in an associate of your tenure. You did not flinch when they threatened a public smear campaign against our board. You simply outmaneuvered them. The opposition relied on intimidation because their statutory foundation was weak," I replied. "I just allowed them to exhaust their leverage against a solid defense." Victor offered a faint, approving smile. "A solid defense is exactly what this firm values," he said. "Vanguard and Sterling operates on a strict hierarchy based on merit, not tenure." The committee unanimously agreed that your output, your strategic foresight, and your composure under fire exceed the expectations of a junior associate. He reached into his desk drawer and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope. The cardstock was identical to the one I had placed on a steakhouse table 2 years ago. He slid it across the polished mahogany surface. It stopped inches from my hands. "We are offering you an early elevation to senior associate," Victor stated. "The compensation package is detailed on the second page. It is a significant adjustment commensurate with the expanded responsibilities you will assume." I looked at the envelope. In the traditional timeline of Delaware corporate law, achieving senior associate status required 5 to 7 years of grueling attrition. I had achieved it in 2.5. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice steady, despite the profound shift in my professional reality. "I am honored by the committee's confidence." Victor leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. His analytical gaze softened slightly, shifting from managing partner to mentor. "We did not place our confidence in you arbitrarily, Adelaide," he noted quietly. "We knew your exact caliber before you ever billed your first hour for this firm." I tilted my head, waiting for the elaboration. "Do you remember the night you signed your initial contract?" Victor asked. "The night at the St. Regis." "I remember it clearly," I said. I walked out of a private dining room with 5 senior partners and saw a 25-year-old girl sitting alone at a corner table. Victor recalled, his tone reflective. "You had just secured a position that thousands of candidates compete for, and your family was nowhere to be found. A lesser person would have shrunk. They would have hidden the envelope, ordered a cheap appetizer, and left quickly out of embarrassment. You did not shrink." Victor paused, letting the memory settle into the quiet space of the executive suite. "You placed that contract right in the center of the table," he continued. "You ordered a glass of water, sat with perfect posture, and claimed your victory in an empty room. You refused to let their absence diminish your achievement. The partners discussed it after we left your table that night. We knew that a young woman who could endure that level of isolation without compromising her dignity would never break under the pressure of a hostile courtroom. We did not sit with you out of pity, Adelaide. We sat with you because we recognized a peer." The words hit my chest with a resonant, grounding force. For my entire childhood, my mother told me that family was the only entity that would ever truly support me. She claimed the corporate world was a ruthless, transactional void. She had the dynamic entirely reversed. My biological family was the transactional void, extracting my resources while offering nothing but conditional tolerance. This firm, this supposedly ruthless corporate machine, operated on genuine, transparent loyalty. They evaluated my actions, recognized my competence, and rewarded my resilience with tangible equity. I had found my true ecosystem. It was an environment governed by clear contracts, mutual respect, and reciprocal investment. "I appreciate the transparency," Victor, I said, picking up the cream envelope. "And I accept the elevation. I will review the package tonight and return the executed signature page tomorrow." "See that you do," Victor replied, returning his attention to the leather-bound brief on his desk. "We have a municipal bond restructuring that requires a lead associate by Friday." The promotion provided the necessary capital for my final transition. 2 weeks later, I sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room at a prominent Wilmington title agency. I was not there to defend a client. I was there to close on a property. It was a luxury townhouse located in the historic Trolley Square district, featuring exposed brick walls, a modern chef's kitchen, and a private rooftop terrace. It was a space designed for hosting colleagues, reading case law by a gas fireplace, and living entirely on my own terms. The title agent, a meticulous woman with silver hair, slid a stack of closing documents across the table. "We just need your signature on the deed and the mortgage agreement, Miss Vance," the agent instructed, handing me a heavy brass pen. I looked down at the signature line. 2 years ago, I stared at a digital forgery of my name, pasted onto a doomed commercial lease, an instrument designed to tether me to my family's failures. Today, the instrument before me was different. It represented equity, stability, and a future I had built from the ground up. I uncapped the pen. I placed the nib against the thick, crisp paper. I signed my name, letting the ink flow in bold, deliberate strokes. The loop on the capital letter was perfectly proportioned. The cross on the horizontal line was sharp and definitive. I was not signing a permission slip for someone else's rescue. I was claiming my own ground. I slid the executed deed back to the title agent, placing the cap back onto the brass pen with a quiet, satisfying click. The winter settling over Wilmington always carries a distinct, sharp chill off the Christina River. I sat in the living room of my new townhouse in Trolley Square, listening to the wind rattle the antique glass of the front windows. The gas fireplace offered a steady, quiet warmth, casting long shadows across the exposed brick walls. I rested a mug of dark roast coffee on a polished slate coaster and sorted through the evening mail I had collected from the vestibule. Amid the glossy local real estate magazines, the firm memorandums, and standard utility invoices, a small square envelope caught my attention. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. The slanted, hurried cursive belonged to my mother. It was a holiday card, It arrived precisely on the second Tuesday of December, just as it had last year and the year before that. I picked up a heavy brass letter opener and sliced the top fold with a clean, precise motion. Inside sat a generic pre-printed card featuring a snowy bridge crossing a frozen creek. There was no lengthy handwritten letter enclosed. There was no heartfelt apology, no inquiry into my well-being, and certainly no request for reconciliation. My mother had simply written a single rigid sentence below the printed seasonal greeting, stating they hoped I was satisfied with the choices I made this year. She signed it from Mom and Dad. 5 years ago, a message holding that much concentrated resentment would have ruined my entire week. I would have spent hours pacing my apartment drafting replies in my head, analyzing every word, and trying to engineer a response that could somehow bridge the gap between us without sacrificing my own stability. I would have internalized her bitterness and wondered if I truly was the villain she needed me to be. Today I read the sentence and felt only a profound, undisturbed quiet. I did not throw the card into the fire. I did not shed a single tear over the relationship we never managed to build. I simply walked over to the small filing cabinet in my home office, opened the bottom drawer, and dropped the card into a folder labeled Correspondence. I closed the drawer. I did not plan to answer it. In the realm of corporate law, when a subsidiary entity consistently operates at a severe deficit, draining essential resources, and exposing the parent company to unacceptable levels of risk, the board of directors must make a difficult decision. They must sever the liability to protect the health of the primary organization. You do not keep funding a terminal failure out of sentimentality or nostalgia. You liquidate the toxic asset, close the ledger, and move forward with your remaining capital. My family operated like a predatory corporation. They structured our entire dynamic around the concept of unlimited non-recourse liability. Connor was permitted to generate endless debts, both financial and emotional, while I was assigned the permanent role of the guarantor. They expected me to underwrite his toxic decisions, subsidize his lack of ambition, and act as the blast shield whenever his reckless choices inevitably detonated. They dressed this exploitation in the language of unconditional love. They told me that family requires sacrifice. They insisted that blood ties demand an unbreakable loyalty, expecting me to honor a social contract they routinely breached. But true love does not require you to underwrite someone else's dysfunction. True love is a reciprocal contract. It requires mutual respect, shared accountability, and a basic fiduciary duty to protect one another from harm. My parents violated that duty the moment they decided my career was less important than my brother's comfort. They permanently breached the contract the day they stole my identity and forged my name onto a commercial lease to protect their own suburban equity. If you are listening to this story, I know exactly who you are. You are the responsible daughter. You are the quiet fixer. You are the child who was praised for being so mature for her age, never realizing that the compliment was actually a trap designed to secure your free labor. You are the one who learned to read the temperature of a room the moment you walked through the door, calculating exactly how small you needed to make yourself to maintain the peace. You paid your own way, solved your own problems, and hid your own exhaustion because you knew the family emergency room was already at maximum capacity. You watched your parents pour their time, their affection, and their financial resources into the sibling who yelled the loudest, while you received nothing but the crushing expectation that you would always be fine. You have spent your entire life believing that your compliance is the rent you must pay to justify your place at their table. You operate under the delusion that if you just work a little harder, achieve a little more, and fix one more preventable disaster, they will finally look at you and recognize your inherent value. You hope they will finally defend you the way they reflexively defend the golden child. I need you to hear me very clearly. They will never defend you. The system is not broken. The system is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. You are the reserve bank account. You are the emergency insurance policy stored in a locked drawer. An insurance policy is only valuable when a catastrophe strikes. They do not want you to possess boundaries. They want you to possess a high credit limit and a low threshold for guilt. You cannot heal a family that relies on your sickness to survive. You cannot negotiate a fair treaty with people who view your independence as a personal insult and your success as communal property. The only way to win is to flatly refuse the terms of the engagement. You must step out of the structural support role you were assigned at birth. I know the paralyzing fear that accompanies that choice. You worry that if you stop holding up the ceiling, the entire house will collapse. You are entirely correct. The house will collapse, but you will not be inside it when the roof falls in. Let them face the natural consequences of their own choices. Let the golden child experience the terrifying educational reality of a bill arriving in his own name. Let the parents who enabled the dysfunction navigate the wreckage they built with their own hands. Their survival is no longer your jurisdiction. Your only legal and moral obligation is to protect your own peace. You do not need their permission to draw a definitive line in the sand. You do not need them to validate your success or celebrate your earned milestones. The people who truly matter, the partners you deliberately choose in this life, will pull up a chair to your table and toast your victories without demanding a percentage of the profits. They will view your competence as a virtue to be respected, not a natural resource to be harvested. Take your life back from the people who only loved you for the burdens you could endure. Stop answering the frantic phone calls. Stop financing the midnight rescues. Stop shrinking your achievements to make room for their endless failures. The equity you build in this world belongs solely to you. The day you stop settling their debts is the day you finally learn what your own signature is worth.
There is an invisible ledger kept in the heart of almost every family. It is rarely spoken about at Thanksgiving dinners, nor is it written into the cheerful embossed holiday cards mailed to the neighbors. Yet it governs the dynamics of the household with a cold, unyielding precision. The story of Adelaide and Connor Vance is not simply a legal drama about a forged signature or a corporate lawsuit. It is a profound cautionary mirror held up to the modern traditional family. It forces us to confront the quiet, systemic ways in which parenting can fracture a household long before any courtroom gavel ever falls. In American culture, where individualism and self-reliance are championed as ultimate virtues, there is a dangerous paradox that often emerges within the traditional family structure. When parents are faced with the disparate trajectories of their children, the natural instinct to nurture can curdle into something deeply destructive. Through the lens of the Vance family, we uncover the devastating consequences of misaligned family responsibility, and we are forced to redefine what it truly means to guide a child toward their future. The first and perhaps most insidious failure in this narrative is the weaponization of a child's independence. In many households, parents unknowingly partition their children into two distinct roles: the child who is always fine and the child who needs to be saved. Adelaide Vance was the former. She funded her own education, secured an elite position in the corporate legal capital of the world, and required no emergency bailouts. However, instead of celebrating this resilience, her parents viewed it as a natural resource to be harvested. When parents treat a child's self-sufficiency as a given, they often begin to siphon energy, financial support, and emotional bandwidth from the independent child to subsidize the struggling one. This creates a tragic dynamic where competence is punished rather than rewarded. The critical lesson here is that a child's independence is an achievement that requires recognition and emotional mirroring. It is never a reserve tank for parents to exploit. True emotional awareness in parenting means recognizing that the child who never cries out still requires the warmth of your presence, not just the utility of their endurance. Conversely, the story reveals the profound toxicity of infinite shielding. Traditional family culture often leans heavily on maxims like blood is thicker than water or family comes first. But in the Vance household, this loyalty was twisted into a shield used to protect Connor from the consequences of his own ineptitude. Under the guise of unconditional love, his parents insulated him from every failure, every broken lease, and ultimately from the legal ramifications of felony fraud. Love does not equate to infinite shielding. When parents refuse to let a child fall, they inadvertently strip that child of the very tools required for survival. Connor never matured into a functional adult because the bill for his mistakes never arrived in his own name. In a society that demands personal accountability, the most profound act of family responsibility is allowing a child to face the natural consequences of their decisions. To let a child stumble and to teach them how to stand back up on their own is the only sustainable way to prepare them for the realities of the world. Shielding them from the storm only guarantees they will drown when the umbrella is finally taken away. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the quiet cruelty of asking a child to shrink to protect another's fragile ego. The image of Adelaide sitting alone in a dim, upscale steakhouse, holding a contract that guaranteed her future, is a testament to this failure. Her parents asked her to hide her monumental success simply because they feared it would threaten Connor's delicate self-esteem ahead of a dive bar musical performance. Fairness in parenting does not mean artificially leveling the playing field by tearing down your highest achiever. When a talented child is asked to dim their light to keep the peace, they learn a devastating lesson. Their success is a threat to the family's equilibrium. A parent's true duty is to teach the struggling child how to find their own footing and strive for their own greatness, not to drag the exceptional child back down to the baseline. Emotional awareness demands that parents validate all victories, recognizing that true fairness is giving each child the specific support they need to grow, rather than forcing them into a uniform mold of mediocrity. Finally, the collapse of the Vance family exposes the fatal danger of valuing public image over core ethical substance. Adelaide's mother was willing to commit a felony, stealing her daughter's identity and forging a commercial lease merely to maintain the illusion of a perfect, successful suburban family. She was terrified of losing the house that served as the stage for her neighborhood barbecues, prioritizing the optics of respectability over the actual morality of her actions. When the facade was inevitably stripped away by the relentless machinery of the legal system, the family lost everything: their property, their social standing, and their relationship with the only child who could have genuinely helped them. The lesson is undeniable. A family's core education must be built on the bedrock of honesty, integrity, and ethical conduct. Teaching children to live authentically within their means and capabilities is infinitely more valuable than maintaining a hollow, glamorous shell. Respectability is not a substitute for morality. The disintegration of the Vance family was not caused by Adelaide's coldness, nor was it the fault of a ruthless corporate law firm. The family collapsed because the parents laid a corrupted educational foundation. They swapped the true definition of love for exploitation, and they confused family loyalty with enabling deceit. These quiet tragedies play out every day, hidden behind the closed doors of manicured suburban homes and unspoken family pacts. If you have ever been the child who was told to carry the weight of the world in silence, or if you are a parent seeking to break these generational cycles of dysfunction, you are not alone. There is power in recognizing the script you were handed and choosing not to read the lines. For more stories of quiet strength, boundary setting, and the pursuit of genuine justice, I encourage you to follow the channel Orange Vengeance. Join our community as we continue to shine a light on the hidden corners of family dynamics and celebrate the individuals who finally learn the true worth of their own signatures. As we step back from the wreckage of the Vance household, we are left to look into the mirrors of our own lives. We must ask ourselves where the line truly falls between supporting those we love and enabling the very habits that will destroy them. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that the deepest wounds we carry are rarely inflicted by our enemies. They are usually delivered by those who promise to protect us, wrapped in the familiar, suffocating language of love. And sometimes the only way to save a family is to have the courage to let it fall apart.